The year was 2001. I had just graduated from Tennessee Temple University with a Bachelor of Science in Bible with a concentration in pastoral studies. It's a lot of words to say I can talk. Right? Of course, my parents were there to celebrate. You know, some people graduate magna cum laude. I graduated, thank you, Lordy. Just saying, keeping it real. My parents were there to celebrate. It was awesome, you know, and we sit through the graduation. And can I just say, graduations, I don't care if it's high school, preschool, college, it's boring, boring, boring. Oh, my kid's name. Boring, boring. Okay, so that's what we did. And of course, we all went out to eat afterwards. And my dad was the master of the buffet. My dad's thing was, well, let's just go to the buffet. Everybody can get what they want. And I'm like, yeah, like food poisoning. Let's just go to the buffet. So we went to Ryan's Buffet in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we're sitting there and we're laughing and we're having a good time. And I look over, and my mom is taking rolls, wrapping them in napkins, and sticking them in her purse. I'm like, Mom, what are you doing? She goes, what? These rolls are good and they're just going to throw them away? And I'm like, Mom, I just graduated college. I don't want purse rolls. I don't. Well, what? And she just kept stuffing them in her purse. Like, I'm like, then the guy would come by, she'd, more rolls, please. Oh, Jesus, take the wheel. I mean, like, I was like, oh. Now, anybody ever had a moment like that where somebody in your family just did something that just made you go, I don't want to claim these people as my own? Anybody raise your hand? No, it's okay if it's the person next to you. It's okay. Just raise your hand. Listen, if you can't raise your hand and say, my family has made me never think that, there's a pretty good chance you're the person. I'm just saying, okay? Here's the point. I tell that story, and it's really, really funny, but here's the point I want you to write down. If you're taking notes, here's the first point. Every family is dysfunctional. Whether it's something crazy and weird, like my mom sticking purse rolls in her purse, right, on graduation day. I'm like, we just paid a lot of money for my college degree. Can't we afford rolls? You know, like that. Or if it's something more serious. But the point is, every family is dysfunctional. Maybe it's something like that, or maybe it's you fighting in I should have stood in the parking lot this morning and took pictures. Fighting in the car all the way to church. Kids, I'm going to get out of the car. Hi. God is good. I'm going to beat you. Right? It's dysfunction. We're all dysfunctional. Every family is dysfunctional, and it might be on a big level. It might be on a little level. It might be, and part of it is because humans are involved in family. We're human, right? It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, educated or uneducated, divorced, remarried, single, young, old. Every family is dysfunctional. I say that so that you can remove the mask you try to put on that you have it all together. Can I just tell you right now, I don't have it all together, and neither do you. I want you to look to your neighbor and go, you're dysfunctional. Go ahead. You're dysfunctional. All right, good. Now, look to your second favorite neighbor and say the same thing. All right, good. You're dysfunctional. Some of you are like, ooh, I should not have said that to my wife. All right, I got it. I'm going to talk. All right, look, why? Why are we dysfunctional? We don't have it. Why? Because we're broken people. We're broken people. And as soon as we take off our mask and realize that we are all jacked up, we're all messed up, we can then begin to deal with the dysfunction in our lives. There is a root issue here. And I love what Paul says in Ephesians. Look at these verses. In chapter 2, verse 1, he says, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world, and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. We're messed up because we have sin in our life. Guys, we gratify our selfish nature. We gratify our sinful desires in our hearts and in our minds, and that's where dysfunction reigns. That's where it thrives. And before we meet Jesus, that's all we have. Chasing human desires leads to problems. Think about it. In a family, if dad chooses to chase his own human and selfish desires, and mom chooses to chase her own selfish and human desires, and the kids decide to do whatever they want to do, that is not the makings for a perfect, peaceful, loving family. That is the makings for dysfunction. And there's a root issue here. We've got to realize that sin is the root cause of dysfunction in our lives. If there's dysfunction in your life, it's because of sin. Now, let me make this very, very clear, because this is the thing that we've got to understand. It doesn't have to be your sin for there to be dysfunction in your life. It doesn't have to be yours. You might not be living in sin, but yet there's still dysfunction in your life. Some of us are just messed up because our parents or our grandparents made poor decisions and set us up in a miserable environment. Some of us were brought up in an unstable environment, which led us to make poor decisions. It might be your sin. It might not be your sin causing dysfunction in your life. But if you go all the way back to the beginning of Genesis, we can see that sin causes issues in relationships. What was the problem with the relationship between Adam and God? Sin. What was the problem in the relationship between Adam and Eve? Sin. What was the problem between Cain and Abel? Sin. Sin is the root cause of the dysfunction in our life. Now, just because we recognize sin as the root cause, I want to say it's not okay to live and just go, well, I'm a sinner, so what? I just got to live in the dysfunction. No, you don't. We are responsible for our own actions. We are responsible for our own decisions. And just because you weren't given everything in a way to make you succeed as a person, as a believer, that's not right for you to stay in the dysfunction. We're going to make the dysfunction functional, right? What am I going to do? It's because of sin. My grandparents, my mommy didn't love me. No, right? You can't do that. You can't blame sin. You just got to recognize that sin is the issue. You know the problem, and it's not okay to blame it. You can make it because you're the one making poor decisions, and I'm the one making poor decisions to stay in that dysfunction. Let me show you what this looks like, okay? All right? It's a big cycle. I want to take you back to thousands of years, okay? I'm going to take you back thousands of years to a guy that we know very, very well, okay? If you've been in church any length of time, you know this name, okay? David. King David, as in, I hit a Goliath with a rock, I ripped a lion's jaw apart. David, I'm the king, I'm the man after God's own heart. You know David, right? Line of Christ, David. Can I tell you right now, David was dysfunctional. David's life was messed up. We know David was a king. We know David was a mighty warrior who led Israel into many, many battles, many victorious battles, and David had built up an army like no other. Back in those days, what would happen was that there would be a period of wartime where all the countries would go out to war. They would plant their crops, they would wait for their crops to grow, and then they would go out to war. The king would lead their men out to war. And that's where we pick up this story in 2 Samuel 11, and I'm going to cover 4 chapters today, so just stay with me. I'm not going to read them all, but stay with me, right? Okay, so 2 Samuel 11, verse 1, it says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. So now I want you to understand something. What is it good for? No, I'm just playing, okay. All right. David was supposed to go to war, but David didn't. David stayed. Now, I don't know what motivated David to stay, but he stayed. Maybe he just wasn't feeling it. Maybe he's like, I've been to enough battles. Joab's got this. I can take care of it. I'm going to sit back and relax and just chill and let them take care of it. And we see that they were victorious. So David stayed home. He was supposed to go here. He was supposed to go here, but instead he stayed home. For whatever reason, he didn't go to war. Now, he's up on the rooftop one day at lunchtime and just checking out the city, and I'm sure the palace was the tallest in the area, and he's just looking out on the city, and I don't know what he's doing, throwing stuff off this roof. I don't know. But I mean, he's up there looking, and he looks over, and he sees this gorgeous woman taking a bath. Now, you're going to tell me that this is the first time that David realized that she takes baths on the rooftop. I ain't buying it. All right? But he looks over and he sees this gorgeous woman and he begins to lust for her. He's the king. Now, we know David had 8 wives. Biblically, through his life, he had 8 wives. Right? So he begins to burn with lust for Bathsheba. He sends somebody to go find out who this is. And they come back and they say, her name is Bathsheba. She is the the daughter of so-and-so and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. David has all the information he needs to not make a dysfunctional decision. But that's not David. So David says, I don't care. I want her. Go get her. Now, David's the king. You don't say no to the king. So David brings Bathsheba to his house, come to the palace, and David sleeps with her. He has an affair with her. Now, Uriah is one of his soldiers who's out to war. Bathsheba goes home, right? And things begin to happen. And here's what I want you to see. Very first point. When I don't do what I'm supposed to do, dysfunction happens. Where was David supposed to be? Where was David actually? At home. David was supposed to be here. Yet instead, David went here. And he went there. When I don't do what I'm supposed to do, dysfunction happens. It doesn't matter what that something is. If you're breathing, if you're alive, God has a plan and a purpose for your life, and there's something you should be doing. And if you go against God's plan for your life, it brings dysfunction. It brings chaos. It brings problems. Look, in college, I had 3 girlfriends, not at the same time. I'm not that guy. But I had 3 girlfriends. I was prepared to marry all 3 because that's just the way my brain works, right? I dated a girl for 18 months, was getting ready to pick out wedding rings, and I found out she was dating somebody else. Oh, yeah. And I had another one that broke up, and I found out my sisters then told me we hated her. Cool. That would have been good information to have, before, but whatever. And then God led me to my wife, Andrea, and we've been married 16 years, and it's been absolutely amazing. But if I had went to the places where I wasn't supposed to go and not followed God's leading and not done what God wanted, then chaos would have happened. Dysfunction would have happened. I follow them on Facebook. I know. Just keeping it real, people. All right. Look, it would have... Listen, if you want to understand the cycle of dysfunction, it goes back to someone, you, your spouse, your parents, your grandparents, your children, whatever it is, someone not doing what they're supposed to do. You have big constant issues in your marriage, somebody's not doing what they're supposed to do. It all starts with someone not doing it. For David, that was not going to war and instead going here. Right? And here's the problem. There are consequences to my dysfunction. Now, most of you know this story. Okay? You know this story. So, Bathsheba goes home, and a little while later, she discovers David, we have a situation. I'm pregnant. My husband is off to war. I can't explain this. I'm pregnant. And you're the daddy. There are consequences to my dysfunction. This is a problem, right? So we know that Uriah is off to war, and we see that here in just a second. So David tries to fix this, which, by the way, don't. David tries to fix this. So David calls Uriah back from war, and he brings him to the house and gives him praise and then sends him home. But here's the deal. Uriah is such a man of integrity, he sends him home thinking, hey, he's going to go home. He's been gone a long time. And I don't know, when you come home from war, hello, baby. Right? I mean, like, when you come home from war, this is what happens. Uriah goes, you know what? That's not fair. That's not fair to my men. And Uriah sleeps on the porch. He sleeps with the servants. He doesn't even go in his house. You want to talk about a slap to the gut to David, that the guy that he's trying to trick has more character than him in this moment. He sleeps on the porch and he won't go in. So David goes, okay, I'm going to get you drunk. David gets him drunk and then sends him home, and he still won't go in and spend time with his wife. Because he says, no, my men are fighting. It would not be fair. So David writes a note. This blows my mind. David writes a note. He seals it. He sends it with Uriah. He hands the note, puts the ring, the seal on it, hands it to Uriah and says, give this to General Joab. Uriah carries the note, doesn't open it, because he's a man of character. He takes the note back to Joab. And the note basically says, hey, Joab, listen, we got a little situation. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to put Uriah in the hardest part of the battle, where all the stuff's going off, like where it's just happening. And then what I want you to do is I want you to blow your little whistle and pull everybody else back. So Uriah's standing there by himself. And he's going to die. This is David's plan to fix the dysfunction in his life, to kill Uriah. Joab does exactly what he's told to do. Sends a message back to David that, hey, it happened. Right? Now, the only people who know what's going on are David and Bathsheba. Or so David thinks. God sends the prophet Nathan, which generally when a prophet shows up, that's not good news. David sits down with Nathan. Nathan goes, I want to tell you a story. And he begins to tell David this story about a rich man and a poor man. And he says, the rich man has all this cattle, has all these sheep, and this poor man has one little lamb that he treats like family. It eats at the supper table. It eats out of his ice cream dish. He sleeps with it, and he pets it, and it sits on its lap, and it's you know what I mean? Like, it's all these things. Yet, the rich man has a friend come to visit, and he wants to throw a party. He wants lamb chops. He doesn't go to his flock. He goes to the poor guy, takes the poor guy's lamb, ribs, barbecue. He serves it up. Well, David is burning with anger, and he says, oh, that rich man should pay. And Nathan looks right at me and goes, you're the rich guy. Oh. And David instantly recognizes that God knew exactly what he did. He goes, you are the man. Now listen, normally as a guy, when you hear you are the man, you love it. But when Nathan said it to David, you are the man, David was busted. And Nathan goes, hey, look, this is what's going to happen to you. There is going to be discord in your family. Your wives are going to be taken away from you. All of these things are going to happen. He goes, and on top of that, the baby's going to die. David has a response. Let's look. 2 Samuel 12. He says, this is Nathan talking. He says, you did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. And this is amazing. Then David said, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. This is a big thing. Nathan calls out David. He says, you did this. You're the man. Now, you listen to this story. You ever wonder why David is still referred to as a man after God's own heart? It's because over and over again in the scriptures, when David is called to account for what he's done, he confesses. He owns up to it, right? He says, I have sinned. He didn't go, well, she shouldn't be naked on her roof at noon. I'm a guy. I got needs. Right? He shouldn't say, well, my parents were divorced. My brothers were mean to me. She was hot. No. He just simply admits, you know what? I messed up. I sinned not against Uriah, not against Bathsheba. I sinned against the Lord. Listen, owning my part helps to stop the dysfunction. Now, here's the really cool thing. When you and I get to the point where we can own our issues, when we can own our dysfunction, God can begin to work in our life. Typically, our first response is to sit here and think and talk and poke at the problems in our family and our other people. We talk about things. I can point out issues with other people in my family. We can all do that, can't we? I mean, if we had a time and we could just share, you'd be like, listen, my sister is a mess, right? And we could just share. Oh, but you want to talk about my part. No, I'm good. I'm good. I don't want to talk about that. David could have pointed out all these different things. She shouldn't have been on the thing. It was this. I'm the king. I can do what I want. Right? Or Uriah should have gone home. It would have been fine. Instead, he owned it. He owned his part in the dysfunction. He went right to the source. Not Bathsheba, not Uriah, not Nathan the prophet. I sinned against the Lord. If we can just own our part, if we can just take off the mask, we can begin to change our family. After all this, at the end of 2 Samuel 12, we see, this is amazing, all of a sudden David goes out to war. If he'd have just done what he was supposed to do, none of this would have happened. None of it. David ends up going out to war. Imagine what would have happened if he'd have just done that in the first place. Do what you're supposed to do. Owning your part is a great way to stop the dysfunction. However, the opposite is true. Let me show you what I mean. If I ignore the issue, the problem will grow. I told you we're going to look at two stories in David's life today. Okay, that's the first one. We see that David was willing to own his part in this story. He confessed his sin, stopped the cycle of dysfunction. It didn't stop the immediate consequences. The baby still died, and the turmoil in his family continued, as we're going to see. But the dysfunction stopped. He was able to stop the dysfunction, or at least the dysfunction with Bathsheba stopped, but not with the rest of his family. Now, we know David had 8 wives, okay, 7 of them, and Saul took his first wife away after David, was anointed king and all this kind of stuff. But let's just say the seeds were planted for issues in the family. Okay, so if you don't have any other reason not to have more than one wife, guys, dysfunction. Okay? All right, so David had a son. So here we go. Check this out. David had a son named Amnon. Okay? From one of his wives. And Amnon fell in love with his half-sister. Okay? He fell in love with his half-sister, Tamar. I mean, and not just fell in love, was like obsessed to the point where he was sick, the Bible tells us. He was so obsessed with her. He's like, I've got to have her. I want her. I need her. I've got to sleep with her. I've got to do all this kind of stuff. In fact, he became so desperate and obsessed with this, he became physically ill, and he desperately wanted to be intimate with her. He devises this plan that he pretends to be sick to get Tamar alone. He asks for Tamar to come make bread for him so that he'll feel better. He wants Tamar to nurse him and take care of him and make him better. So he gets Tamar alone in his bedroom. He succeeds, and he rapes her. Okay? Now, if the story stopped there, that's enough dysfunction. And I know there might be people in here who are family members or have experienced this, and I want you to understand, this is not okay. He rapes Tamar. And then, all of a sudden, when it's all over, the passion he had for Tamar turns into passion against Tamar, and he hates her with everything he has. And he kicks her out. And 2 Samuel 13 tells us that she puts ash on her head and she goes into mourning and she goes to her brother. Now, her brother's name is Absalom. And the amazing thing in this story, just bonus part, is Absalom had absolutely gorgeous hair. It said when he cut his hair, it weighed 5 pounds. Absalom had flowing locks. And my pastor growing up just used this whole story of Absalom where he got killed because his hair got stuck in a tree to say men shouldn't have long hair. But Absalom, I know, it's terrible, right? Absalom finds out. Tamar runs to him and he's like, what happened? And she tells him. And Absalom's like, okay, Tamar, come live with me in my house, and I'm going to take care of you. And I'm going to take care of this. Don't worry about anything. I'm going to take care of this. So now, if you're tracking with me, all right, we got David. You know, he has Amnon and then Tamar and Absalom, and this whole story is beginning to be a mess, okay? So Absalom is burning with hatred. And somehow David gets wind of this, because he is dad. He gets wind of this whole thing. You would think that David would immediately call a family meeting, that David would immediately go talk to Amnon, that David would immediately find out exactly what happened, and he would handle his family business. But here's the deal. When dysfunction hits the fam, you know David didn't handle it right. 2 Samuel 13:21, here's what it says David did. When King David heard all of this, he was furious. That's it. That's it. That's a good start, but that's it. He was furious. You know what he did? Nothing. He did nothing. He got angry. He did absolutely nothing. He got mad. He did nothing. He didn't comfort his daughter. He didn't talk and deal with his son. He didn't even go to Absalom, Tamar's brother, to find out exactly what happened. He didn't do anything. Basically, he just ignored the issue. And if I ignore the issue, the problem is going to grow. And guess what? In this situation, it all went away. No, it didn't. It didn't go away. It got worse. What could that look like in your life? What could that look like in your life? Maybe it's hopefully not this, but maybe it's an issue you and your spouse are having, and you just kind of want to ignore it. You want to push it under the rug. Don't. Maybe there's something you need to sit down as a family and discuss, but you keep closing your eyes and hoping when you wake up the next morning, it's gone. Maybe you see your teenager slipping away and you just don't want to confront them because they're your best friend. Knock it off. Slap yourself. Okay, that one got a little personal as a youth guy, sorry. All right, look. Whatever it is, if we ignore the issue, if we ignore the sin, if we ignore the dysfunction in our life, it doesn't get better. David ignores it, and you know what happened? 2 years. 2 years later, Absalom has gathered the sheep shearing men at his place, and he sends David a message, says, hey, come out and watch this. Bring the family. David's like, listen, we can't. He goes, send Amnon. David goes, okay. He sends Amnon out to watch Absalom. Absalom tells the men, hey, when Amnon gets here, I'm going to give you a signal, and I want you to kill him. Two years after Amnon raped Tamar, Absalom then kills Amnon. Absalom bolts and goes to a place called Geshur, and for 3 years, David wanted to go to him, but he didn't. Listen, if you're sitting here today, there is a reason God has you here. If you're sitting in here today, God has a plan and a purpose. Maybe you've got to deal with some dysfunction in your life. Maybe you're waiting and you've waited long enough. Maybe you held on and you need to let it go and you need to move on. Maybe you need to face the dysfunction in your life, take off the mask and deal with it. Or you need to talk to someone about what you see in their life. Don't do nothing. Now, remember David, man after God's own heart? David's referred to still to this day as a man after God's own heart. How on earth could that be true after he let all this stuff happen in his life? Look, I'm not saying that David failed as a father, but this builds a pretty significant case. That's pretty hard to come back from. And there's still more to this story, like Absalom trying to stage a coup and kick David off the throne. But here's the cool thing. You ready? Here's where we flip it around. God can still bless in your mess. Check this out. You might be sitting there and you know your life is a mess. You even know why it's a mess. Maybe you're living in sin. Maybe your family's living in sin. Maybe you just don't know what to do. God can still bless in your mess. In your mess. First story in the midst of this, right? In the midst of the mess. David's baby had not died yet. Okay, the baby wasn't born. It didn't pass away. The consequences weren't through. And David confessed and he owned up to it. And God kept his promise. You won't die. It's impossible for us to make our lives such a mess. I want you to hear this. It's impossible for you. It's impossible for me. It's impossible for us to make our lives such a mess that God can't still work, that God can't still bless. If you think God can't bless in your mess, you're not worshiping the one true God. God can still bless in your mess. God can still do what God wants to do. Look at what Paul said in Acts 13, okay? Years later, after all of this, he says, after removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, and he begins to quote Samuel. I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. From this man's descendants, God has brought to Israel the Savior Jesus as he promised. You know the craziest thing? The craziest thing in all of this, David started his relationship with Bathsheba by having an affair. Do you know that Bathsheba was mom to? Solomon. Do you know whose lineage Solomon is in? Let that sink in. God used an affair to bring about the line of Jesus. God can still bless in your mess. Now, was God happy about this? No. We should never have affairs. But God can still bless in your mess. And according to Matthew 1, Solomon was in the line of Jesus, which means Bathsheba was in the line of Jesus. God can still bless in your mess. That's amazing. Dude, if you don't take anything away from that, just go, you know what? I might be messed up, but God's still God. God can take the mess of your life and do amazing things. And now, do you think this would have happened if David had handled this situation like he handled this one? I don't think so. David showed us the right way and the wrong way to break the cycle. So let's talk about breaking the cycle. Let me give you just a couple points. How do we do that? Let me give you just things as your starting guide. If you really want to break the cycle of dysfunction in your life, and hopefully it's not this bad in your life and you can just deal with it. Let me give it to you. You ready? Very first thing, recognize it's there. Walk out of here and go, hey, what did you learn at church today? I learned that I'm messed up. I know that's weird to say, right? And you're like, but just listen. And just say, look, that's okay because God can work. You might be facing something that has become normal in your family. Guys, you might look at marriages in your family through the genealogy, through the generations, and see that all the men treat their wives the same way. And it causes dysfunction. Ladies, you might look at your marriage and see that you treat your husband the same way your mom beat down your dad and broke him into submission. The same way your grandma beat down grandpa. You might look at your pattern of work and realize that when things get tough, you switch jobs. Or when money gets tight, you credit up. You have to be willing to ask yourself, where am I dysfunctional? Remember the first point, every family is dysfunctional. And you have to be willing to not accept it as normal. So recognize it's there. Then you have to ask/give forgiveness. In some cases, after you recognize your dysfunction, you might need to ask for forgiveness. There might be someone in this very room that you need to go to right now and ask forgiveness to. You want to talk about making it real? It is humbling when you've got to admit you were wrong to somebody you care about. My dad passed away in February, and now I'm seeing these little things in my life that remind me so much of him. Right? So many of them are good, man. The way he never met a stranger, the way he always spoke highly of people, his work ethic, how much he loved his family. But I am aware of one thing that my dad passed on to me. Now, don't get all sappy and be like, oh, no, listen, here it is. Look, my dad struggled to say I'm sorry. My dad didn't struggle to feel sorry. He struggled to say I'm sorry. What my dad would do is if he got into a aggressive conversation with my mom or into an issue with the kids, my dad would walk away. And then my dad would turn on the charm and he would go and he would buy ice cream or he would do something and just do something amazing. And that was his way of saying, I'm sorry. But my dad would never say, I'm sorry. And so I know that that's not really, really good. That's a little bit of dysfunction in my life, and I've got to do better with that. And I catch myself doing that, and luckily my wife catches me doing that. I'm pretty lucky that I don't make a lot of mistakes. My wife's not in here right now, so it's all good. All right. No, listen, I got to be very careful not to fall into that pattern. So I have to ask for forgiveness. I have to go to my kids and tell them that I handled things wrong, that I blew up. I got to go to my wife and go, I'm sorry that I mistreated you. And that is humbling. And sometimes the flip side of this is true. I have to give forgiveness. Even if they don't ask for it, even if they don't deserve it, give it. I've had family members hurt me. I could tell you story upon story of how family members have hurt me. Would you believe that not everyone is happy with the church staff all the time? Would you believe that? And sometimes we have to forgive you even when you don't think you need to be forgiven. And sometimes you have to forgive us, like after this message. Right? Forgiveness, give it. You know, sometimes we have to give and we have to ask for forgiveness if we're going to break the cycle. And then I have to change the pattern. The joke is that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If you want different results, change the pattern. Guys, if you want your marriage relationship to be different than what you saw in your parents, change the pattern. Don't be your dad. My parents got divorced after 38 years of marriage because I think they raised 5 kids and they looked at each other after raising 5 kids and went, I don't know you. That's why every October, my wife and I, we go away, just the two of us, for a week. And we go somewhere where there are no cell phones. That's it. Because I'm changing the pattern. I don't want to get to 38 years of marriage and go, that's it, I'm done. Right? Change the pattern. Ladies, if you want a different kind of relationship, change the pattern. I can look back on my parents' marriage and see that there were some patterns that I will fight tooth and nail to keep out of my marriage to make sure it doesn't happen. Change the pattern. Dig in, fight for it. Some of these things are going to take years and years to fix. Some of them will be overnight, but change the pattern and break the cycle. And here's the really cool thing, the very last point I want to give you, right? When you break the cycle, check it out. You get to give God the credit. Oh, you get to give God the credit. Ultimately, if we're going to make the dysfunction functional in our lives, it's through the power of God that's going to help us do it. God brought us back to life. God gave us the ability to love deeper. God gave us the ability to walk in the Spirit and carry out his mission. And when we see success in breaking the cycle, we should be the first ones to point out it's all because of God. Look at what Paul continues in Ephesians 2. We read the first 3 verses at the beginning. Here's what he says. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. God has made you alive. God has a plan for you. God wants you to break the cycle of dysfunction, and it's going to take grace. You're going to have to ask and give forgiveness a lot. And you're going to have to fight to change the pattern. And when it's all said and done, you can give God the credit. You can make dysfunction functional. The band's going to come back up and lead us in a song called Gracefully Broken. And I think it's perfect. Listen to these lyrics. Check us out. It says, oh, take all I have in these hands and multiply, God, all that I am. And find my heart on the altar again. Set me on fire. Set me on fire. Here I am, God, arms wide open, pouring out my life, gracefully broken. My heart stands in all of your name. Your mighty love stands strong to the end. You will fulfill your purposes for me. You won't forsake me. You will be with me. Listen, if you're gracefully broken today, take care of it. While the band leads us in worship, come down here and pray. If God poked you in your spirit during this message and began pointing out dysfunction in your life and you need to fix it, talk to him. You can sit, you can stand, you can do whatever you need to do. If you need to go talk to somebody, by all means, do it. Let God know that you are gracefully broken today. Take off the mask and work to make the dysfunction functional.